ka. Or I guess if we're talking in a non-religious context, it would be you and not ka. So, I'm glad you all came today. Watson Harlan is my name. And I'm going to be talking to you all today about Nulitanaustana or the history of Cherokee. So perhaps more than just talking about the events themselves, we're going to talk a little bit about the 18th century as a whole and trying to imagine Cherokee history as part of the 1700s rather than it being its own separate little cordoned off thing that has no meaningful impact on anything else that happens, when quite the opposite is true. So without further ado, let's get the ball rolling. I always hear all the time, you can't change history. Yes, you can. People do it all the time. Historia, or the ancient Greek word that we get from our lovely pal Herodotus, means the stories. Stories are imperfect and they are told by people. We really like neat narratives that are easy to remember because they help us understand the past in a neat and digestible fashion. The past is neither neat nor digestible, so one of the things that we are going to do is we're going to talk about, firstly, Cherokee history, and then second, Cherokee public memory, or how do people remember Cherokee and what do people remember about the Cherokee Nation in the 1700s, which is less than I would personally like, but I'm very biased on this if you can't tell. So history does have its own shortcomings, as me and Ava have talked about all the time, where we really like written documents and primary sources and things to draw from things. So we don't really like talking to archaeologists, and sometimes archaeologists don't like talking to us. And so sometimes we're like ships passing in the night on our research, which creates lots of annoyances that agitate everybody in the field on all sides. So we're also imperfect. We like to imagine that with our modern technologies, with our ability to disseminate information and our capacity to look at things on the global scale, that we are a lot less fallible than our previous generations. We are not. History in and of itself is an art form and a science that is beholden to the politics and the economics and religious factors of its day. So what we're going to talk about today is how Cherokee history fits into American history and how American history fits not only into Cherokee history, but the broader history of the world in the 1700s. So if that's pretty clear, let's hit the road. All right, I'll just give you the point. You got it. All right, so why Cherokee? Well, for starters, I am Cherokee and I like doing Cherokee history, so you guys get to enjoy my blatant bias and favoritism towards my own nation's history. Although, as I understand it, that is the tendency of many nations to like their own history quite a bit. But importantly for this lecture, American history can't be told without Cherokee history because the relationship between the United States and Cherokee is one that begins at the inception of not just the United States, but the inception of Cherokee and British trade that begins irregularly and informally at the end of the 1600s and then persists into a real international relationship by the 1730s. So Cherokee actually has its first international agreement with the British Empire that is signed in London by Cherokee delegates in 1730. So the Cherokee people are not people that are uncontacted. We are not people that are unaware of the global world around us. And we are not just acting in isolation. The Cherokee Nation in 1730 has faced military pressures from neighbors that have gunpowder while we don't. We've been faced with issues of emerging settler encroachment in South Carolina that has resulted in the early destruction of several of our lower towns, which has forced internal migration of Cherokee peoples from upper South Carolina further into western North Carolina and into what is now eastern Tennessee. Our political capital has actually moved over to the town of Deliquo Utena, or Great Tellico, which is where Tellico Plains is now, right nearby us, well, relatively. So we have lots of Cherokee military activity going on over in East Tennessee, and we're prosecuting a almost 2 centuries long war that's been going on against the Muskogee. Although the Muskogee have undergone several brand name changes between the start of the conflict and where it's at in the 1700s. As in the 1500s, it is the Coosa Paramountcy that those of you who took Ava's wonderful hike will be quite familiar with. So the Coosa system breaks down due to the shattering that happens at the end of the Mississippian period, and Cherokee, with its unique decentralized government and its democratic institutions, weathers this giant apocalyptic happening of diseases a lot better than many of our neighboring nations. So we end up becoming pretty powerful because nobody else is. We sort of occupy this vacuum of authority and move further into the regions of Kentucky, Tennessee, even Middle Tennessee becomes like a ranging ground, then an effective frontier between us and the Chickasaw, who have had their state established since prior to contact. So this isn't just an isolate group of people. This isn't a group of people that are not involved in the geopolitics of the continent. And we're aware that there are multiple colonial powers around us because there were silver prospectors from France that were operating within the Appalachians throughout the 1600s. There's the Spanish who have actually been around us and made their first contact with us in the mid-1500s. I actually live right near a spot that I would hesitate to call this diplomacy. But when the Spanish arrived, they were not liked in the Carolinas. And unlike Central America, where they had a large hostile empire that they could oppose with local support from the conquered peoples, they just kind of flipped the table on a bunch of local diplomacy and made enemies of basically everybody in the American Southeast. This didn't go well for them, and their colonial ambitions in the Southeast collapsed, leaving them with just Florida and some positions on the coast. However, they didn't just stay there. They did lots of business, particularly with the Muskogee and, later on, Cherokee people. They would actually be some of the people illegally supplying us firearms during our resistance to American occupation in the late 18th century, because the Spanish governor believed that the Americans would be unhappy with their territorial acquisitions after independence and would start trying to take Spanish territory. He was right. So you can kind of see how imagining Cherokee as an isolate or an individual place creates some roadblocks to understanding history on a longer time scale and in a larger frame, right? You can start to see how it can't just be Cherokee history. I have to talk about Spain. I need to talk about the English. I have to talk about all of our tribal neighbors that we have conflicts, diplomacy, and trade with. All of those things exist at those times, and they don't magically just begin because somebody started documenting us. They come from a long period, right? So you see that we might appear there and that you see historic Cherokee beginning in 1775. But that's not really the case. Cherokee people have been here for quite a long time. Gadua Mound, our first town, the new mound at Gadua is from 1000 AD. So I feel like we've been here for quite a while, even if it's not exactly here. But I would actually challenge you to find a group of people that has actually been in the same spot for 7,000 years. Even the Muskogee, who are the people that we were fighting East Tennessee for control over, their original oral history begins with migration from across the Mississippi into the Southeast. And their story is just as important to understanding this. So you should be excited about this because it puts it all together for you, connects the whole web of events together. And most importantly, it moves us on to our next slide. Okay, so when you're thinking about how traditional historiography of American history gets done, typically with Cherokee, they talk about like three big things. The first is the Cherokee-Anglo War, which they don't really talk about the motivations for it. It actually begins with a conflict where some civilians living in colonial territory kill several Cherokee warriors and sell their scalps for money. Okay, so that snowballs into a larger conflict because the British Crown refuses to hand over the responsible individuals. And so the offended party, the warband with a military commander, then unsurprisingly goes on a retaliatory raid, which then gets reported by the colonists who are the victims of this retaliatory raid as an unprovoked attack on civilians, which then results in the British government threatening us. And rather than seek a peaceful solution to this, we decide that we've had enough of these abuses because it doesn't just start over this. There's been decades of trade imbalances and abuses that you can read about in the Journals of the Commissioners of Indian Affairs for the colony of South Carolina. So there's 30 years of documents that you can look at to read about the business that the British did with us. And rather than just seeing it as the fur trade, and rather than just seeing it as us trading for iron and guns and those kinds of things, it starts out as an international defense agreement where we're going to become a defensive ally of the British Empire. We don't pick this because we like the British, actually. And if you read Henry Timberlake's journal, he actually says we make no secret of the fact that we don't like the British, but they offer us the best trade deal. The French treat us better, and the Spanish actually give us better deals, but neither of them have the economic positions to be able to supply us with firearms, textiles, and iron goods like the British can. So we go into business with them. But the British, realizing that we're their only trade partner, they try to do a lot of misdealings with us, and individual merchants begin shorting us on fabric. They undersupply trading posts with the goods that were promised by that 1730 agreement. So we do have it in writing. It's not like we're not engaging in the diplomacy here. It's not like there's a misunderstanding. The British government is intentionally lying, and merchants on the ground are also intentionally lying. And we're mad about that because that happens for several decades. So when that finally boils over, it's no longer just a misunderstanding, but it's a fundamental disconnect between British trade policy and their written agreement with us that is finally pushed to a boiling point by an altercation where our citizens who are attacked by settlers are denied justice. So when we're talking about historiography and framing narratives, removing the facts and sanding off the details removes not only the complexity, but the real reasons as to why it happened. And how that negatively affects American history for us is that the result of this war is that most of these backcountrymen, most of these colonial settlers in the Carolinas, they see the peace treaty that Britain signs with us at the end of the war as a betrayal of their interests. And so many Carolinians, many of the early Overmountain men, many of the Virginians and the would-be Kentuckians, and even some of the early Tennesseans, see Britain as having betrayed their agreements because Britain promised them land. And now they are putting limits on land settlement. They are forbidding land purchases with native peoples. And they are guaranteeing the boundary line as of the Proclamation of 1763. So the revolution, at least here in the South, is not solely motivated by a desire to be free of the British crown, but is motivated by the economy of land speculators and frontiersmen and fur trappers that wish to economically advance their own interests at the cost of native states because they see it as a guarantee that has been made to them by their imperial power. That's a lot more complicated than just we wanted to be free from Britain. And it complicates the revolution in a good way, I think, because these people didn't get along with some of the Americans. Henry Knox and George Washington regularly butted heads with these groups of settlers, with these land speculators, because they would come to the table with illegal land deals. They would engage in settler agitation. They would send settlers to the wrong side of the line on purpose to inflame conflict and to sustain warfare, which they could capitalize on as land speculators. Because once an American settled that land and it became part of the United States, and then they got killed in this violence, they could then move in and claim the land and sell it to somebody else. So there's a whole lot of profiteering going on by these early land magnates. And that's one of the main motivators of this settler action that's in this part of the country at this time during the American Revolution. It's not just we want freedom, we want money. And these people at the top want it pretty bad. John Sevier is one of them. He regularly assigns federal troops to people that are actually wanted by the federal government for attacks against native civilians. Because even the federal government at the time in the 1780s and 1790s, they see it as a problem. But how do we remember it? In the 19th century, lots of people liked to change this narrative into, oh, it's natives attacking civilians and settlers. And so you see pieces of artwork that are like this, where it depicts warriors kidnapping women and children. Although, from a practical standpoint, what's the alternative to taking somebody captive? Right. And so what's funny is that the Cherokee party that was interested in violently resisting American territorial encroachment, the Chickamauga Cherokee, or the Chickamauga, which means like the lesser portion or like the faction. Basically, they're called a splinter cell. They're literally called a faction group. They are not the majority of Cherokees. They are a small group of young and militant Cherokees who come from a political ideology that was actually established decades earlier by Muskogees who were trying to establish a Southeastern Confederacy. It didn't work at the time, and their leader, Big Mortar, got assassinated by a Choctaw man because the British placed a bounty on his head. Like I said, none of this is not connected, but the connections that are there are way more complicated than we really have time for today, right? So when you see art like this, it's intentional, retroactive propaganda that obscures the historical reality that exists within our documents. We have documents, we have missives, and we have treaties, and they don't line up with these stories that are made later, partially in the interest of Americans, right? Like, this is supposed to be Dragon Canoe making off with Daniel Boone's daughter. It was a really popular story at the time because those settlers could then circulate it and then say, oh, those Cherokee people were doing that to our settlers. They're ignoring or leaving out all of that context because it created a means by which those same land speculators could create public support for further settlement and military actions against Native people on the border. That wouldn't have existed if they had actually undergone better diplomacy and better trade, which was attempted. The United States actually built Tellico Blockhouse on the north bank of the Little Tennessee River, not as a protection to keep settlers safe from Cherokees, but to keep Cherokees safe from settler invasion. And actually, when they got to the spot where the blockhouse was, there was already an illegal trading post on it. There was a guy that was not supposed to be there who had already built his trading post. So if you look at Tellico Blockhouse's blueprint, the trading post is actually that guy's trade post, and they just built the fort around his trading post. So when someone tells you that it was violence on both sides or that it's equitable, they're oversimplifying it for their own benefit and to the detriment of doing real historiography based off of documents, based off of the archaeology, based off of people's reports. If you'd like to read about Tellico Blockhouse, we actually have a journal from a pretty significant historic individual named Louis Philippe. Yeah, that one who became King of France. He actually visited East Tennessee in the 1790s on a tour of North America, and he stopped in the Cherokee Nation for a few days to visit. He documented the fort. He documented several anthropological things about Cherokee that actually make for a great primary source. And he actually documented the life and the lifestyles of people living along the frontier. My favorite thing was he found out that American innkeepers are actually notoriously bad hosts because many of them were legally obligated to become innkeepers by settler laws. If they were the largest landholder in an area, they were required to keep an inn so that people could lodge and travel into the frontier. Something that they loathed doing. So the food was usually bad, the service was horrible, and they tried to get you to leave as fast as possible because they did not want to have to spend more money than they had to on keeping you fed and watered. You can go read about that from Louis Philippe. You don't have to take my word for it. So when I say we're talking about real stuff, a lot of Native history tends to focus on our spirituality, our cultural things, how we make baskets. That's important, and I really love it. I used to work at Koala Arts and Crafts at our art cooperative where we try to keep that stuff alive so that we can use that as a historical resource. But it totally ignores the economics, the geopolitics, the everything else that, real people's lives are governed by. And it's to the detriment of our own understanding of the past and our own reckoning with it, which, as someone who's both Cherokee and an American, I don't want to abide by, because I feel like the best way that we can reckon with our past is to understand it on a deeper level and to see everybody involved in the process as a human being on a fundamental order. People have needs and wants. These collective needs and wants manifest themselves in politics, in culture, in religion, and in economics. And they are not isolated. I was mentioning, we can actually keep going from here. Now we've gotten to this part. So, how we show up in American historiography is usually pretty one note. There's like only one thing that we get talked about in terms of direct history, and it's Indian removal, which is really important, and you should know about it because it's maybe one of the most defining actions of United States history, is how it decides to treat Native peoples that it governs. It becomes, in the words of Claudio Sant, the framework of Indian expulsion becomes the framework by which European powers and imperial powers the world over use to commit their genocides. The Circassians that live in Russia The process by which they are exterminated is a process that Tsar Alexander II got from George Gibson, who was Andrew Jackson's administrator who oversaw Native American removal. American history isn't just America, it's the world's history too, just as much as the world's history is part of the United States. Why did the Russian Tsardom want to expand into those areas? The same reason a lot of those land speculators, industrialists, and people wanted was to accumulate resources and to centralize the power of the state, right? So when we talk about Indian removal, even in the perspective of American historiography, we tend to think of it as being isolated, as in it's just the Southeast, even though there's tribes in the Northeast too. We talk about it as a sad inevitability, is how it often gets framed, that it was always going to happen. But actually it wasn't. It was hotly contested, even in the American halls. The Capitol building had furious debates over this. Multiple people had days-long speeches for and against Indian expulsion. And the people that were against Indian expulsion were mostly Christians and mostly the Whig Party of the United States. So if we're talking about Indian expulsion, and specifically Cherokee expulsion in the context of it, this 18th century stuff, all this land grabbing, is for expanding plantations, right? These southern landowners aren't just fur trappers. They're people that are invested in building cotton plantations, cattle drive operations, and infrastructure that sustains the South's early economy, which is a deeply uncomfortable topic because its underpinning is chattel slavery, which the Cherokee Nation began to adopt at the end of the 18th century. The first slave owner in the Cherokee Nation's history is actually Nancy Ward. She purchased 3 African-American slaves from Charleston in 1777. Like I said, this is going to really complicate lots of historical individuals, and one of them that I really want to complicate is Nancy Ward, because she's often depicted as being a bridge builder, a peacemaker, and a diplomat between the United States and the Cherokee Nation. But she actually faced a lot of internal backlash for her actions, not only for the introduction of chattel slavery, but also for signing on to American interests during the course of the war. She was actually the aunt of Dragging Canoe and actually informed the United States military of several of his military actions and positions to try and dissuade him from pursuing military resistance against the United States. So without her aid, the United States would have found itself much weaker in a position fighting the Cherokee. But also, the Cherokee would have been more unilaterally seen as hostile enemies of the United States, rather than being people that were on the fence about the matter. So that brings us to one of our next figures that we can talk about in terms of historical narratives, Dragging Canoe. He's maybe one of the most important Cherokee individuals to this region. Ziyugan Shini, right? All that stuff that I was talking about with the fur trade gets to come to his life. He's born on Amoyele Ekwa, or the Big Island town. The Little Tennessee River used to have a giant island in the middle of it that had a Cherokee city on it. That was called, the English called it Mialakwo because they didn't want to say Amoyele Ekwa. So they really shortened it down there. But he was born there, and one of the main events of his life was going to fight in the 7 Years' War as an auxiliary serving with Ostanako or Utsirihin Ustanakwa, who was, again, that pro-French, anti-British Cherokee Nation guy in the 1760s. He serves with him as a soldier. And then afterwards, when the American Revolution begins, Dragging Canoe decides that he wants to continue this resistance against settlement, even if the settlers are no longer declaring themselves British. It's not just him coming as a bolt out of the blue. He's not a divinely inspired individual who comes from nowhere. He comes from a living political tradition of resistance. He's lived his whole life having to fight settler encroachment. He's fought wars on behalf of these settlers too, because he fought for the British in the 7 Years' War. So it makes him a lot more complicated than just a Revolutionary War figure. And he is actually not very popular with a lot of other Cherokee leaders. A lot of them want to remain isolationist, and some of them, like Nancy Ward or Adagakala, who's another 7 Years' War figure that we don't really have time to talk about today, they're actually pro-integration into the United States and essentially want to become part of the United States after it's done gaining its independence. Which their faction gets a lot more strength after 1783, when the United States actually does achieve its independence. But that same group of settlers that I've been talking about this entire time are land speculators like former governor of the Southwest Territory, future senator of Tennessee, William Blount, John Sevier, a lot of people that are considered to be seminal to the foundation of Tennessee. A couple of them didn't even want to be Tennesseans because John Sevier started out as a Franklinite. He wanted his own independent country that was independent of the United States. But then as it turns out that without the backing of the federal government, he's actually not capable of winning a war against the Cherokee Nation. His state is almost destroyed in 1786. And so by 1788, he basically gets an ultimatum from the feds where they say, either you can become part of the new and burgeoning state of the Southwest Territory that will eventually become Tennessee, or we can just let the Cherokees finish smoking you because the Cherokees are actually like basically right at the door of Knoxville at this particular moment in time. So it's not a cut and dry. It's not just a victory for the United States. John Sevier does do a lot of horrible things. He actually burns Watauga, one of our largest cities that's in western North Carolina between Niquosi, where Franklin is, and Cowie, which is another one of our internal trade depots. So he's not the only guy. North Carolina has Griffith Rutherford, who comes in from Old Fort and goes through what's now the old Smoky Park Highway that runs through Canton and Clyde. That's actually the same route that he took to go into the middle towns and burn those out. So that's another complication we can add to this history. Whenever you hear about pioneers, you hear them moving into undeveloped regions or underdeveloped or not utilized regions. But it's not that they were always empty, and it's not that the native people there didn't do things with them. Usually in the decades leading up to this settlement, there would be intense conflict that would force people to move out. It would create these large, barren patches where there weren't any people living, and then those settlers would move into that. So when you hear about settlement in these regions, it's not just they're moving into empty space. They're moving into space that was intentionally emptied by the intentional violence started by these economically interested individuals. And they're making poor Americans die on their behalf, right? Because these poor settlers don't have better options. They see settlement as a way for them to get land, for them to move up in their own society. And so they buy into these land companies, they get involved, and then they get killed. Sometimes by us, sometimes by just exposure, because these people are being left without state infrastructure and left to fend for themselves. And that complicates how we talk about settlement. It's not just us and them. It's not just Cherokees and Americans. It's individual groups of people that have their own political factions, their own economic motivations, and how they have to interact with one another. Because fighting is tiring. And for as much as I've talked about war, there's large periods where there's lulls, there's gaps in the conflict, where nobody's fighting, where people have to figure out how to do business with one another. This entire time that all this fighting is going on, there's still Americans that are trading goods with Cherokees. There's still Cherokees that are asking about how their friends in Charleston are doing. If you read William Bartram's 1775 botanical book, his section where he travels through Cowie, the headman at Cowie actually asks how John Lawson in Charleston is doing and asks to send a letter along to ask how John is doing, because he knows people in Charleston and wants to keep up with his political discourse and his personal correspondence with his friends. This world that we study in the 1700s is so much more complicated than it just being settlers and natives, than it just being the Tennesseans versus the Cherokee, than the Chickamaugas versus the not Chickamaugas. And what I think is beautiful about it is that when we study these things, it helps us ask better questions about our own time and about how we think of the past. Because now, how many of you think about the 1700s differently already and we're not done yet? Can I get hands? Yeah, right? And now you're going to be annoyed by how many questions I haven't answered yet, and you're going to want to go learn more about that on your own, right? So may we continue? Okay, so when we talk about public memory, that's how everybody conceives of the past. So how all of us in this room, what's the common ground that we all can take away? What do we all agree on, right? We all agree dragging canoes is a real person. We all agree the Cherokee Nation is real. We all agree that the colonies are real. We agree that the United States is going to exist at some point, even though it actually kind of comes in right there at the very end of this century, right? In 1700, nobody is even thinking of the United States. That's not something that registers to people, right? That's not even a name that the colonies have for themselves until they're done winning independence in the 1780s. The idea of being American is there by like the mid-century. But the idea of being the United States is kind of at the tail end of this period that we're talking about. So to that end, we have a nasty habit as people, and us as historians especially, because we, again, like neat narratives that stick together. This map is totally wrong. This is from 1760-ish, but like none of this is real. If I went anywhere in here and said that the British controlled this region, all of the native people, no matter where I was at, would laugh at me. It's even called the Indian Reserve because it's not even really under British control. It's basically the British government going, okay, whatever happens on that side of the line, we don't care about because we cannot govern it and we cannot control it. That goes all the way to the Mississippi River. That goes all the way to the Missouri, right? Spain legally claims all of this stuff. I don't think any Lakotas that were living up here would really like it if you said that Spain owned them. They would take very grave offense to that, and they'd be right to do so, and there wouldn't be a Spanish guy around for several hundred miles because their nearest fort is like down here. So when you see those little maps in your textbook, how accurate are they really? Because even when I'm thinking about the 13 colonies, about half of this is still not really habitated even by colonists. There's about a 50-mile buffer between native territory and colonial territory on the inside of the colonial border because there's not actually that many colonists until the production of domestic food and the arrival of enslaved labor promulgates within the American South. So this is also a very generous interpretation of what the 13 colonies even looked like. If you want to think about what's practically controlled, what's within the authority of the state, and who actually lives there. There's still Catawbas that live here at this time that still control the area where Charlotte is. Charlotte is actually a city that's founded by the Catawba in the mid-1700s. Chattanooga is founded as a trading post by a Cherokee leader who's not even a leader yet. He's just a random flatboatman who's a military veteran. When we think about these people as they were at the exact moment that they're doing these things, not only do we get a better picture of history, but we get a picture of how it unfolded, right? Because when we think about John Ross, the chief, we're imagining the guy in the portrait, right? That looks kind of like Johnny Cash. But realistically, he was still kind of a young guy who basically got racismed out of his job because Georgia and Alabama made it illegal for Cherokee people to own flatboat operations. At this time period, the British are actually making it illegal for British merchants to sell us iron goods. Not finished goods, but like anvils, hammers, repair tools, things to actually make our own goods, because they're aware that we don't have some manufacturing technologies. However, they're also aware that we're trying to get them. It's kind of a myth that we don't want them. Almost as soon as firearms arrive, Native people are asking for them and are asking how to make them. In fact, when we have our first diplomatic meeting with the people of Charleston in the 1690s, that's one of the first things we ask for. Is we ask for iron tools, we ask for firearms, we ask for liquor, and we ask for textiles. Coincidentally, those four things all make it into our 1730 agreement that we have in Whitehall, although that's a whole saga that really wasn't actually supposed to happen at all, because the guy who was our diplomat was actually just a crazy Scottish guy who was deluding himself into believing that he was a British official, and he just so happened to, while in London after having got all these Cherokee people to London, he accidentally ran into Thomas Fane, the Lord of the Commissioners of Trade. So like, even the way these treaties get signed is not regular. It's not like they have the pens and the big fancy. Yes. Was that the guy with the awesome crown? Yes, that is Alexander Cumming. His wife had a fever dream that he was going to be king of a nation in North America, and he was a random nobleman in Scotland, or a random Scottish nobleman living in the United Kingdom. And he decided to run with this perhaps too far. He defrauded several merchants in Charleston and stole their stuff, pretended that he was part of a diplomatic negotiation, and then ditched the diplomatic negotiation, ran ahead with a translator, and then did all of this business without the knowledge or consent of the British Crown. The British government is not, I don't want to say that they're not smart, but they're not like, they don't have it together. Every one of these 13 colonies, see how this is a big continuous red blob? That's not how these colonies were. Every single colony had its own charter and had to manage its own diplomacy and trade with natives separately until 1763. So this was just a giant tire fire of multiple conflicting colonial governments that even had conflicting interests. Virginia and South Carolina fought for 15 years over trade rights with the Cherokee Nation because of how valuable the deer pelts coming out of the Cherokee Nation were. But because Virginia couldn't build a fort, and because Charleston could, and Charleston could provide guns and trade goods, they're the ones that got the business. That's why Charleston is what it is, right? The British Army is supplied with leather from these goods. So if you want to talk about the global history of this, let's think for a minute in the 18th century. There's a Cherokee guy that hunts deer pelts. He trades them to a merchant in South Carolina. That leather in particular is actually going to the British Crown itself to supply the military with leather. At the same time, by the 1760s, Britain is a little interested in a different kind of Indian on the other side of the world and is starting to engage in military operations in Bengal near Calcutta. About a third of the leather that was in the British military is coming from the Cherokee Nation. So the bandoliers, the powder boxes, all the gear that these soldiers are wearing when they're taking over India, coming from here, coming from Muskogee territory, coming from North America. Again, Cherokee history is not just Cherokee history. Native history is not just North American history. This stuff reaches much further than we tend to think it does. The collapse of the fur trade promulgates the rise of Moscow because suddenly there's a shortage of beaver pelts after the beaver wars. Who has beavers and who has fur trading stations? These Russian guys who have just started colonizing Siberia in the 1600s. They're replacing those missing furs that are missing from the European market. Those big hats that you see the pilgrims wearing that are made out of waterproof beaver pelt fur. It's either from North America or it's from Russia. And gradually the beavers stop being the main trade here and they stay being the main trade in Russia. Russian imperialism isn't possible without British imperialism. And the British common market for these goods is what allows all of these other states to economically succeed and create these common markets that preserve these states and these orders. But at the same time, they don't control all that. It's still native people that are participating in these global economics for their own benefit at the time to survive, right? To do business, they have to have a European trading partner. Otherwise, you don't have firearms, you don't have textiles, and most importantly, you don't have a European ally, which means every native person who does have a European ally sees you as a free target, because all of these people are having to compete over an increasingly small land base and an increasingly small number of furs. So the worsening of settler violence and the worsening of violence between native states is a direct consequence of this 18th century fur trade. You can't think of that unless you think of Cherokee as being part of the world, right? So I hope that I'm getting this through. So we're going to talk about maps specifically on the next slide. So this map, which is like the one on the back of that door and is available right over there in a little pile, and I highly recommend a couple of you take it home with you. These are all the land treaty agreements that we had. So everywhere between the Ohio River and the Tennessee River here, that's Cherokee land at some point. It's not all of ours at the same time. We kind of start out around here. We expand into South Carolina. We expand over into Tennessee. And by the 1700s, this whole area is realistically ours, fairly uncontested. However, this upper region is very sparsely populated due to the previous century of another group of natives, the Haudenosaunee, driving most of the native people out of the Ohio River country. Some of the French people moving through there actually note that at the nadir of this, the worst part of the fighting, there's nobody living in Ohio. Almost everybody's been driven out by warfare and conflicts over the fur trade. So when you're thinking about the fur trade, it's not just trade, it's people fighting over the trade. Every one of those beaver dams, every one of those populations, that's a resource that those native people are competing for so that they can maintain their military and economic stability. But back in the day when this is actually happening, this is what Europeans think Cherokee country looks like. There's multiple towns on here that have the same name. They're not sure what river it's on. They don't know where any of this stuff is. This is the Henry Popple map from 1733. It's considered to be the most accurate surveyed map of North America, and it doesn't even know where the Mississippi River begins. People thought until the middle, well, I should say Americans thought until the middle of the 1700s that the Mississippi River began at the Lake of the Woods in Canada, which is actually unconnected to the Mississippi River in its entirety and is in a different drainage basin. So when we're talking about what types of information people are working with in the 1700s, it's very imperfect. Once you got about 50 miles outside of Charleston, you could be on the frontier in 1730. The back country of Charleston is not even where Columbia is. The border with the Cherokee Nation, as you can see, is actually like Columbia is around here. So the Cherokee border is south of Columbia. And during the middle of the century, when we're actually fighting the colony of South Carolina, the border is at Saxe-Gotha-town, which is near Orangeburg. That's not far away from the coast. That's like 60 miles from the coast. So we're not talking about like the states as we imagine them today. We're talking about the states and the process of their accumulation and their building. And you can even see between 1733 and 1884, there's a whole lot of technological changes. They don't invent, they conceive of and then apply triangulation to maps. They start doing better and more accurate surveying. And, well, we're a lot better at mapping out rivers now than we used to be. You just kind of drew a squiggly line with all the major features on it until it got to the stuff that you really needed to tell somebody about. Whereas nowadays we can say, well, it's this deep at this point and it bends at these places and it used to be here based on this archaeological data. None of that is being done at this time. Nobody's thinking about that. Most people are just thinking, does stuff grow good here? Does it flood? Very practical, pertinent, and day-to-day questions. So the maps are the result of that, right? And just like our maps today are imperfect and they're retroactive imaginations. Even on this map that's from 1884, it has superimposed modern state borders. These survey boundaries for these treaties are ridiculous. There's no way that anybody could actually enforce those at this time, right? This first treaty, that's 1721. That's before this map is even around. The last treaty, 1836, is only 50 years before this map gets made. So when we're talking about Cherokee history and the 18th century, I know this may sound really obvious, but 100 years is a very long time. And so think about where your family was 100 years ago. What were they doing? Who were they? And so when we talk about like if a period is Cherokee or Muskogean, am I different from my great-grandma because my great-grandma doesn't know what a cell phone is? Am I no longer a Cherokee person because of that? Is Dragging Canoe not a real Cherokee because he uses guns, has a liquor distillation operation, and has invited multiple people from different countries to be part of his military resistance against Americans? I don't think anybody in this room would not consider Dragging Canoe a Cherokee person. But he did all those things. He also participated in traditional elements of Cherokee culture. And he even invited Muskogees, Chickasaws, and escaped slaves to be part of the Chickamauga. That aforementioned distillation operation was actually run by slaves that escaped from Charleston. He let them set up shop there, and they provided sugar and alcohol to his war effort. Because obviously, enslaved people have a pretty good reason to not want to be part of the United States, especially the southern colonies. So there's another complication to add. At the same time that Nancy Ward is buying people from Charleston, Dragging Canoe is sequestering them and keeping them from being enslaved. So when we're thinking about the Cherokee Nation, it's not quite just Cherokee people, right? It's not just the Chickamauga. It's not just John Ross. It's not just slave owners. All of that's happening a lot more contemporaneously than most people like to believe. And magically, our history doesn't have these nice epochs. When it goes from 1799 to 1800, there's not everybody that goes, oh, the world's different now. That's true for this. Next slide, please. So to that end, how can we make a more honest history of the 1700s? So Firstly, with maps, because I like them a lot and I think we can do better. I hate that most maps of Native America are just random names with no real boundaries or any inkling as to the time period. They're just like America at contact, which isn't a great phrase because also there's been people on the Pacific that come from all kinds of crazy places. There's Tlingit people living in the Pacific Northwest that have Chinese coins woven into their armor that's from the 1600s. There are the Pomo who live on the coast of North California, who have boats that are built in Polynesian style because Polynesian migrants arrived there in the Middle Ages and left them that bit of material culture. There's chickens from Polynesia that are in the Incan Empire in Peru before there's any Europeans there. So let's stop thinking of it as just these little isolated little bubbles, because one, that's not how the world works, and two, it's actually way cooler that that's not how the world works. It would actually be really dull if everybody was just this imaginary group of people that perpetually saw themselves as this unmoving group of individuals. Cherokee itself is an iterative people. We have processes that change. We have altered religious customs. We have a blend of the composite peoples that compose the Cherokee Nation in the 1700s. Our language has borrow words. Wechan, lecha, comes from French for cat. Waka comes from Spanish, vaca. We have Muskogean borrow words. If you live out west, they say wado instead of shkin for thank you, because the Muskogee word is mado, and the trade language for the southeast was Mobilian, which was Muskogee. Well, a Muskogean language, because modern Muskogee is just one of several dozen languages that existed at the time that got coalesced into one language. Even Cherokee nowadays, there's like 3 or 4 different dialects of Cherokee, and it's a critically endangered language that has like 1,500 speakers left. So the complexity that the world presents to us in 1700 is far and above what most of us really want to comfortably think about. But I think that that's okay. So, second, there's mutual interests here. Us native people, we're not magical spiritual people that are above reproach. We make bad life choices. We make bad decisions. We make things out of our own self-interest for our economic and political motivations. It would be really foolish to think of anybody as acting without those interests as a government or as a people. We're interested in promulgating firearms because all of our neighbors have firearms, and if we don't, we will lose battles against them, lose territory and resources. That's part of our history, just as much as settler violence being done to us is. And it doesn't make either of those things good or bad, right? They happen, and they have individuals that we can ascribe to, and they can be part of larger historical moments, and they can be representative of it, or they can be against the grain, right? Dragon Canoe is about as against the grain as you can get. He is a militant faction of his own country to resist its settler encroachment by a country that is also trying to gain its independence from its colonial overlord. It's way more complicated than it just being settlers and Cherokees, right? Finally, Europeans and natives have a long history of doing business with one another. And I don't just mean that in they engaged in the fur trade business. Like almost as soon as native people encounter colonial people, there's business. When the Puritans set up in Massachusetts, the first native guy that they run into already speaks English because he's been doing business with English fishermen that have been off of his coast for decades. By the time the English have contact with us, we already know who the English and the French are. We already know who the Spanish are. We already know what Christianity is, in fact. There's a Jesuit missionary that comes to us in the 1720s that asks us about Christianity, and the headman at Tellico stops him about 20 minutes in and says, no, we've heard that before. You believe in a big man above, and if you're good, you go up, and if you're bad, you go down. Stop talking. Like, there's already an awareness to it. And it's not perfect. It's really difficult to get through language barriers, religious understandings, and cultural customs. And that's what creates some of those conflicts, right? There's not anybody in the Cherokee Nation that cares what a surveyed real estate line is. There's nobody in the Cherokee Nation that knows actually they do know what a pound sterling is, but it's not very relevant to them because they're not doing business in sterling. They're doing business in pelts, gunpowder, and the physical resources that they need to keep their country going. So when we examine these relationships more earnestly, more closely, and listen to what these sources tell us, it creates a portrait that's amazing. And I picked this image on purpose. This is Henry Timberlake's map of the Overhill towns. So it's important to note there's already been a giant war, but he actually notes that Chota, our capital at the time, is called the metropolis. And he notes that there's several miles of the Little Tennessee River that there's no woods along because it's all either agricultural cultivation, cultivated orchards, or Cherokee towns. We're not little small villages. We're not these little scattered people. We have a capital city. Amoyeli Equa, which is actually down here on this map, it's tiny now. It had multiple people abandon it, and its population actually swells after Timberlake is through here because there's tons of refugees from South Carolina towns which got burnt out during the war. So there's internal migrations and refugee problems that now are things that we can think about and incorporate into our history. So with that, here's some books that I would highly recommend if you're interested in Native history or interested in changing how you think about Native history. Some of these are going to be Cherokee, and some of them are going to be a little broader. So Barbaros is one of my favorites. It's a book on the Spanish Empire in the Americas. It's an honest one, and it predominantly focuses on the diplomacy and intercourse between the Spanish crown and the native governments that continued to exist after the Spanish took over. Because although, yes, if you look at the map that's in your history textbook, you will see that most of North America and all of South America, except for Brazil, is painted yellow for Spain. That's not really how it was. Spain took over the stuff that they considered to be the most valuable and the stuff that they considered to be vital to their logistics and their infrastructure for extracting wealth from the New World to supply their kingdom and crown back in Europe. Same thing they're doing in Asia at the time. All the silver that they're getting from the New World, that's going into East Asia where they're trading it for porcelains, tea, spices, and textiles. The Spanish silver peso remains a standard currency in circulation in East Asia until its abolition in the mid-1800s. The stuff that happens here in the Americas is truly global history because it involves itself in the world. The Spanish people that have contact with us, Arturo O'Neill, who is the governor of Spanish West Florida in the late 1700s, he actually sees the Muskogee and the Cherokee nations as potential allies against American expansionism. Before America's even really solidly a thing, he thinks that the colonies are going to be expansionist if they gain independence. So he starts sending us firearms. So Dragon Canoe doesn't have his resistance unless he's got illegally imported Spanish guns, Muskogee resistance fighters, escaped slaves from Charleston. You can't think about it as it just being Cherokee people. It's mostly Cherokee people if you're around here at the time. But there's other people and there's other histories that are all coming together for those singular moments. So The Comanche Empire by Pekka Hamalainen is awesome. It's a telling about the expansion, rise, and collapse of the Comanche state entirely from their internal perspectives. So rather than examining it as the Comanche being a border force that's on the edge of the Spanish or the American realms, it's specifically about the Comanche and focused on them. And it's just so detailed that I have to throw it in here because it actually mentions the Cherokee Nation out west, because the Comanche actually had minor conflicts with the Cherokee Nation after removal because some of their raids actually threatened people living north of the Arkansas River. Like, these things intersect in ways that go far beyond. Carolina in Crisis by Daniel Tortora. Got to rep my homeboy since he's from my home state of North Carolina. He actually explores the racial dynamics of how enslaved peoples interacted in the colonial world and how Cherokee people interacted with the race-based society of South Carolina at the time, which had chattel slavery. That was the bulk of its economy. And how Cherokee people reacted to being part of this global world. It's a real focus on the war, but it appreciates the social context and the economic context that it happens in. West of the Revolution by Claudio Sant is specifically focusing on areas of the Revolution that are not in New England. So it talks about the American frontier at the time, which is Appalachia. It talks about the Indian Reserve, and it talks about how the Revolution is seen by other people on the continent at the time. So you can actually get kind of a feel for how other powers that were around the United States as it formed, how they thought of the United States forming for good or ill. Last, Cherokee Power by Christopher Wray. His is an interesting geopolitical conceptualization where he talks about Cherokee as being a trade power that bridges the Ohio River Valley to the Atlantic coast, and how we use our strategic territorial position to play European powers off of one another throughout the middle of the 1700s. So all of these are fantastic books in their own right, and many of them contributed a little bit to this presentation today. So I wouldn't be here without a lot of this literature. With that said, we can move on to our next slide. There's all my citations. I did want to mention this one because when we're talking about older conceptualizations of the fur trade, most of that actually comes from this article by Wilma Dunaway, and it's not actually very old. It's from '94. Her analysis, her data, and her fur trade stuff is spot on for the numbers. But she puts the fur trade in the context of it's modernizing the Cherokee Nation by introducing it to the British imperial economy, which, as I've already stated by the rest of this presentation, it's a double-edged sword. It's not a net benefit because now they have trade deficits and now they have economic dependencies on European imperial powers, which actually impedes independence. And if you read the letters of the Commissioners of Indian Affairs from Carolina, the blind slave catcher of Watauga in a letter in the 1750s, he actually writes to the government of Charleston and specifically says this is causing trade imbalances and is collapsing the domestic industries in pottery, basketry, and all of our local goods because people are buying slave-made goods that are supplying these trading posts. You should fix this either by sending us more goods or by lowering the prices so that more people can afford what's available. English is not his first language, so the guy that he's dictating this to, it's a little ragged, but you can understand the point that he's making by reading the letter. And I feel like Wilma Dunaway, while her numbers are really great, I feel like she misses the internal Cherokee perspective in this. So I included it on this so that I could just talk about it. Duane King's book is not just Duane King. It's about 8 other authors who are all experts in their field as of 1979. And it's multiple essays that have to do with the nation's history from the start of the 18th century up until removal. So if you're looking for a bit of selections on different portions of that time period, there's a really interesting one about the 1790s journeys of former Chickamauga leaders to Kingston, Jamaica to do business with British colonial officials. So there's a lot of really cool international history that's hiding in little nuggets in that book. So I thought I would throw it up there just for fun. And lastly, boss. You're all good. Thanks. You've made it all the way to the end and you've sat through me yapping at you for about an hour. So I'd like to thank you for your patience and perseverance. And I'd love to open the floor up to some questions for you all. All right, and now that the presentation's over, I'm going to take this off before it gets gross because this thing is way harder to clean than a t-shirt is. So ask away. I'll answer to the best of my abilities, and if I don't know, I'll just tell you. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. There's nothing connecting those people. Yeah. No. Yeah.
Curiosity, and then all of a sudden you hear about the trading and what really was going on in the 1600s.
Yeah.
Or 1500s, 1600s, up to where we were. So I guess my question is, in your opinion, is it accurate to say that in the initial beginnings, when the white Europeans were coming here and realizing, hey, there's other people we didn't know about, that they actually are more friendly towards each other?
This largely depends on the colonial power and the nature of their colonization. The early English colonists, like the Puritans, they're religious refugees because they were religious extremists who were ousted from England because they took over the government and everybody hated them a ton, so they gave them the boot. Um, the first guys who started doing business with them, that guy that I mentioned who already spoke English, the very first thing he actually said to them was, "Welcome, Englishmen. May I come in for a beer?" Like straight up, it was very personal diplomacy. They're doing business with the Abenaki pretty quickly. And a lot of it is commercial at the start for small settlements. Now, that's an entirely different thing than what the Spanish are doing per se. The Spanish are conquistadores. They are literally called conquerors. They're mostly military veterans and mercenaries from the province of Extremadura in Spain. They are there expressly for money. If you read their 1517 Requerimiento, which is their document of government, they would essentially walk into towns and they would tell native people that you're now under our government and you'll do what we say. And if you don't do what we say, that gives us the legal right to kill you and enslave your women and children. So there are as many wide ranges of diplomacy as there are types of people. So Europeans that were interested in mineral extraction and outright conquest often had really bitter conflicts right from the get-go. But groups of settlers that were interested in mutual cooperation or that sought passive or even active and friendly relations with their native peoples do happen. Although there's inevitable friction because most Europeans not only enclose land, so they deny access to land and resources from other peoples. The diseases that they introduce are actually noticed by native peoples. And so the hostility gets worse as these infectious diseases start to seriously destroy native populations, which then causes the destabilization of many native cities. The Southeast is actually a giant patchwork of native city-states that all systematically collapsed between 1500 and 1650 because of the arrival of diseases that are brought in by the Spanish. And as a result of that, plus the Spanish acting kind of like jerks to everybody around here, future interactions are more hostile. On top of that, the arrival of firearms is creating a promulgation of militarized native states that have to focus on the development of their military to the detriment of most of the other sectors of their society. Most of the native powers that become regional powers, your Haudenosaunee, your Wyandot Confederacy, Cherokee, the Muskogee, all of them are military-centered governments during this time period because they have to dedicate a huge amount of their state's resources and their people to maintaining some type of political stability against endemic violence that has been worsened by the arrival of colonists. So while the individual diplomatic interactions might not be bad, colonial governments themselves and the way that they're administrated almost guarantee conflict between these groups of people, if that makes sense. All right. Yes?
You mentioned that Tellico Tower.
Oh, Great Tellico at Tellico Plains.
Yeah, is that where Loudon is?
No, actually. Okay, Tellico Blockhouse is just called Tellico Blockhouse because an American guy thought that would be a good name for it. That one is at Vonore. The actual town of Tellico was actually down by Tellico Plains, about 30-ish miles away. Yeah, Fort Loudon was constructed in the 1750s at the behest of colonial governor William Henry Littleton. It was constructed to essentially be an embassy, although naturally it's a military garrison that had about 80 people in it, a lot of whom were soldiers. The grenadiers who oversaw the construction of the fort actually did not like where the fort was at all. And Fort Loudon was not really well funded or built, and it was built expressly to outcompete Virginia. So that South Carolina could be the main interlocutor between the Cherokee and the British colonies. They say that, but like practically speaking, it's to maintain political control and influence over the Chota government, which didn't actually entirely work because the government in Chota regularly courted French diplomats. Audemars Guillaume de Lantagnac was actually the French agent who was posted in Chota. He was actually a fraudster who had been exiled from Montreal. And they basically gave him the job of, you can either go to debtor's prison or you can do dirty work for us, and we'll send you to be a diplomat in the Cherokee capital city. 1756 to 1763, although ostensibly the conflict between the French and the English crowns in the 7 Years' War has a lot more fronts than just the French and natives, because these native governments are trying to figure out which colonial power is going to win. Ultimately, what helps the British secure their victories is that they have an on-continent supply of manpower, their colonies are more consolidated, and the French exercise most of their colonial control through proxies. So they'll make a fort, and then they will leave the fort and a few colonies around it, and then the rest of the native controlled lands will be their allies, which meant that on one hand, the French had a much easier time doing diplomacy with native peoples, and in fact, many people in the Cherokee Nation actually preferred doing business with the French over the English, but the English were able to supply their native allies with more firearms faster. So it's not just defense against the French, because, there's not actually any French that are going to invade through the Cherokee Nation. It's just a physical impossibility. Further north and further south, the two nearest positions to the Cherokee Nation are Fort Toulouse, which is in Alabama, and then Fort Massac, which is actually at the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi. Yeah, for a brief while, the French actually took over colonies like Mobile and New Orleans. It's Orleans, right? It's named after Orleans from France. So they have a colonial presence there. The Choctaw really don't like them, so they side with the British. The Muskogee are right next to the British, so they side with the British. The Chickasaw don't like that the French are right nearby with their position at Fort Massac, so they side with the British. And because all of our enemies side with the British and are getting British guns and there's no French near us, we side with the British, so that now all of our enemies that normally don't like us and would be fighting us can't, because we're legally on the same side. Although the British kind of go behind our back on this one and intentionally inflame tensions between the lower Cherokees living in upper South Carolina and the Altamaha Muskogees who live around the Savannah River in Georgia. And they intentionally stoke conflict because they don't want both of these nations to be aligned against Britain. And so for a large part of the 18th century, Big Mortar, that Muskogee guy that I mentioned, was courting French support while also trying to create a Cherokee, Muskogee, and Chickasaw alliance in the southeast. However, in 1777, he was assassinated because the British put out a bounty on his head because he was actually the most wanted guy in the southeast because he was trying to create a pan-native resistance. His ideas didn't die with him, though. He actually is one of the people that inspired Ostenaco and Dragon Canoe, and Ostenaco and Dragon Canoe would actually go on to influence Shawnee war leaders along with Delaware political leaders, Blue Jacket and Little Turtle, who would actually lead the Northwestern Confederacy in the northeastern United States against the early United States. And then those guys would influence Tecumseh. So it's all part of this actually quite alive political tradition of native resistance that isn't just isolated to singular states. Cool, right? All right. Does that answer your question? Cool. What do we got?
I'm never quite clear. Did the British have a deliberate policy of getting people in debt so they could, force them to trade land for?
Oh, totally. It wasn't always the British doing it on purpose, though. At a systemic level, they were okay with it because it benefited them monetarily and politically to have more power over these nations that were economically enchained to their imperial economic system. However, individual merchants were also known to do this, not just through offering credit, but by having crazy interest rates on loans. Because when you needed to buy your powder and shot before the hunting season, it's before the hunting season. So of course you don't have any pelts. So they're like, well, if you bring me this many pelts, I'll front you this powder and shot on credit. And this would continually happen. And since having gunpowder, a firearm, and lead to actually shoot with gave you an economic advantage over your non-firearm owning compatriots in your country, almost everybody got into doing business with these merchants. The poor regulation on the part of Britain meant that several of these trade posts actually had engaged in shorting people in their trade, quite literally. There were measuring sticks that would be issued to these trading posts so that they could measure out the cloth or that they could weigh furs and pelts. Several of these merchants were actually caught shortening their measuring sticks. A very famous one, this involves Ostanaco. Ostanaco found that the merchant was shorting his town on trade by cutting his measuring sticks short. So after a couple years of the British doing nothing about this situation, Ostanaco resolved it personally by disemboweling the merchant in the middle of the guy's trade post. He then walked to Fort Loudon from Tellico and then told the captain what he did and why he did it. And the captain was like, well, you just admitted to killing a British citizen. Why shouldn't I hang you here for that? And so Ostanaco was like, well, I happen to be a military commander from the largest military town in this country. So I would highly advise you reconsider that action before you do it, unless you want everybody who's part of my army coming up here to get back at you for killing me. So you should fix my problem, and then this won't be a problem. How this all ended up resolving was that Mr. Raymond Desmarais, who was the captain at Fort Loudon, he fixed the problem, but then a few months later he resigned from his post, citing that he had health issues, and his brother Paul was actually sent in his stead the next year. So I'm not going to say that Raymond Desmarais faked an illness to get out of maybe being murdered by Ostanaco, but it's not a possibility that I want to rule out because of just how close those two events are together. That all check out? Yeah, you got it.
What's your take on their community theater of Viking canoe?
If you can believe it, I haven't seen it yet. I haven't actually had the luxury to go up there in quite a long time, and I didn't get to see their community theater. Although I must profess from the stuff that I have seen that places like Loudon, I'm a little disappointed with Loudon because they have the British guys win the fake battle that they have, which is not how that went. Fort Loudon got captured, and we were actually gonna let everybody from the fort go free, but then Paul Desmarais thought he could renege on his treaty terms with us. So he was going to be let go from the fort for free, provided that he let us keep the gunpowder, the shot, and the cannons that were in the fort. However, him thinking that he's more clever than us, he had his grenadiers throw all the stuff in the river the night before he beat feet out the next morning. And perhaps unsurprisingly, he couldn't outrun the Cherokee party that caught up with him, and him and his band were, the soldiers were executed, as was Desmarais. However, the women and children were kept as war captives at Chota, and Henry Timberlake would actually be sent afterwards to negotiate for their release. And about 43% of them actually refused release and remained Cherokee citizens. About 87% of those remaining captives after the Cherokee-Anglo War were women because they could be property holders. They had legal power in the government, and they had a lot more legal and social powers as women in the Cherokee state than they did as colonial people. So a lot of the women that were living in the Cherokee Nation that were European in the 1700s did so because it was politically advantageous and gave them greater rights than living in South Carolina did. But to kind of better answer your question, I feel like one of the modern shortcomings of a lot of public history facing stuff is that a lot of the reporting on events goes uninterrogated. So with Sycamore Shoals, it's a treaty that's supposed to establish a set boundary line between us and the United States, and it's not upheld really at all. Not because of the direct federal government's actions, but the actions of individual people living around the area. And I feel like the interpretation that I have seen at Sycamore Shoals doesn't go deep enough into that for my liking, but it's really easy to be a critic. If I had to redesign their whole lecture hall and everything, I probably would have to figure out how to thread the needle there myself. So I'll try to not be too disparaging because I want everybody who participates in the historical field to do so as colleagues and not as me trying to start some kind of fight with somebody, because ultimately our goal as historians, as academics, and I believe as human beings, is to better understand one another and to have better dialogue about what we do. We have any other questions?
And I know you kind of talked about this
Mea culpa.
So, in your understanding, where did the Cherokee people really come from? Because they really weren't here, for so long. And even when we get into looking,
I'm going to answer that question with another question, and then I'm going to give you a real answer. Where do Americans come from? They show up somewhere, and they've been there long enough that they'll identify as a group of people, right?
so I guess that's what I'm saying. So they were people.
Yeah. So let's talk about our oral history then a bit. So our myth for ourselves is that we came to be as a nation at the city of Gadua, which is literally the word for town, Gaduha. That is in modern day the area near between Ela and Bryson City in Swain County. That is basically our home base. That is the foundational place of the Cherokee Nation. However, our language is part of the Southern Iroquoian family of languages, meaning that the predominant language that we speak actually comes from people that were originally from further north. However, our political culture and our religious culture is derivative of the woodland and Mississippian period religious groups that existed here in the Southeast prior to the arrival of said Iroquoian-speaking peoples. So it's likely that, like many people, we are actually a conglomeration of multiple people who came together, combining our language, culture, and religious traditions into a group called the Cherokee. Well, actually, we were called Aniyawiya to begin with, but for the sake of this lecture, we'll stick with Cherokee for ease of clarity for everybody in the room. And this group of Cherokees originally probably were part of the Mississippian system. So we originally had kings who were religiously based, who participated in the Mississippian land system, which is a relatively stratified class-based society that has a group of autocrats up top who are a recognized ruling class that in Cherokee we would call them the Anaktana'i. However, in our oral histories, we actually have a myth where we overthrew them because of their systemic abuses against people, particularly women in our community. So to combine that with some of the extant primary sources that we have, if we open up Spanish accounts of what's going on in Cherokee territory at the time, the people that live around us all tell us that the Cherokee territories are hostile to them. Not just one group, but almost all the groups. I think that if there was a group of people that suddenly killed all of their ruling class and the rest of the area around you was made of that same kind of government with that same ruling class, it would probably make that group pretty nervous, especially because we immediately engaged in flipping towns around us and incorporating them into our new democratic system that we would have established sometime in the Middle Ages. It would have been after the establishment of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, so I can feel fairly confident in saying that our democratic society and nation were solidly established between, say, like 1000 and like 1400. That's a really big time period because we don't have primary written sources, and I only have an oral history that I can go off from that time period combined with archaeology. But suffice to say, our actual origins, I feel like, get used against us too often because the fact that we weren't magically in the same spot that we've always been sometimes gets used by people to justify saying, well, everybody's taken land from somebody else as a way of retroactively justifying colonial action, which we never engaged in the systemic displacement of other peoples that we actually took over, which actually is documented. Whenever we occupied East Tennessee from the Muskogee, the people living there were also not Muskogee. They were Yuchi, which was a different group of people who are not related to either the Iroquoian peoples that became Cherokee peoples or the Muskogean peoples. So if you're asking where a tribe comes from, you're not going to have a very satisfactory answer because that's not really how it just happened over that time period. The same way that like the English people originally were not just like the Angles by themselves. It was the Angles, the Saxons, and the Utes who then colonized from Denmark into England. If you look at history on the long time frame, it's not going to make a lot of sense if you think in terms of, well, when did that happen? If that makes sense. Yeah. And for what it's worth, we do consider several sites that are not Cherokee to be politically and culturally relevant to us. So, for example, one of the great mother towns of the Muskogee, Etowah, is considered to be religiously and politically significant to us because that was the epicenter of power for Mississippian peoples in this region. So we kind of see that as a place where we draw a lot of our political, cultural, and religious heritage from, even if culturally and politically speaking, we get a lot of our influences from elsewhere. Kind of like how the United States actually has statues of both Tribonian, who is a Roman guy, and then also we draw a lot of our laws from English common law. So although Americans are neither Roman people nor English people, it would be weird to not acknowledge the role that both of those peoples have in historically transmitting culture to Americans. At least that's how I think of it. Anything else? These are really good questions. I really like answering these. I have so much fun thinking about history and thinking about how people actually lived, right? It's really cool to learn the big names, the fancy battles, the trade agreements and things like that. But thinking about someone day to day having to negotiate this world that exists is a thought that I can't ever really escape in my free time. As you can see, I've made something of a career out of it. Yes.
I'm fascinated by the concept of oral histories. How are those kind of presented today, given that they're not static and written down, they change when told? And I guess how much do they change over time?
They're quite beholden to distillation. Details get sanded off so that stuff remains transmissible. When I talk about our oral histories, there are written anthologies of our oral histories that were compiled by Emmett Starr, Charles Royce, James Mooney, Frank Speck, other anthropologists that have visited either the nation out west or here. And then there's internal studies that have been done by the tribal cultural agencies that represent the 3 federally recognized bands. So oral history as we know it is kind of like, what can we corroborate from these multiple written sources that people also still talk about? And then if we do find an oral history that mentions a specific individual or an event or something like that, what can we look for in archaeological finds? What can we find in historical records? And what do people remember in the general public? So the art of doing oral history is a bit of a tricky one, because as historians, we like it in writing, although sometimes I feel like we as historians like to pretend that writing is different from talking in that it takes almost the sacred quality on when it's written down. But realistically, writing is also beholden to transmission errors, issues of loss and print. And also, writing has this unique thing that happens where we can reference other stuff, and then that other stuff might get lost. So, for example, Thomas Ballinger's book on the law and traditions of the Cherokee Nation, he has oral histories that he got from interviewing Civil War veterans because he wrote the book in the 1920s. I have no access to any of the people that he interviewed, nor do I have his interview transcripts. So I only have his secondary piece of literature to go off of. But does that make his source less valuable? Or does it make it more valuable because it's the only place I have that information now? I steal this lady's quote all the time, Anna Komnena, who is a Byzantine historian. She always says, as historians, we tend to grasp with our hands to save what scraps of the past we can from the river of oblivion called time, which, awesome quote, love stealing it. But we really only have a pretty small portion of what happened back in the day. If you want to think about like ancient Greek and Roman stuff that we think we have a lot of, we have like less than 2% of the total volume of stuff that we even know about, and less than like 1% of the stuff that we actually have copies of. But presumably there was stuff going on, we just don't know about it yet. All we can hope for is that we find stuff that helps us prove what we're looking after. Well, you all about tuckered out, or do you got some more for me? Woo! And I just want to thank you all for coming out and showing your support. It means a lot to me that you want to come out and talk with me and hear what I have to say. And I hope that you take what you learned here today, even if it's just like, maybe you might think about the Spanish Empire differently. Maybe it's something about Cherokee that you think of differently. Maybe when you're going through Chattanooga, maybe imagining the world that has come and gone here multiple times is now a reality to you, right? that I can breathe a little bit more of the past into your present is my ultimate goal as a historian.
I gotta say, as much as I've spent time flying over dragon canoe, I never knew that he was in the 7 Years' War, so I learned something new already.
Yeah, and the only thing that really connects that, or that I was able to find out, was that like Henry Timberlake mentions that one of Dragon Canoe's lieutenants, that's part of his personal squad of 8 people, is a relative of Otagunkala. And Otagunkala and Ostenaco hate one another because Otagunkala is the head of the pro-British faction, and Ostenaco is maybe one of the most pro-French guys in the whole nation. So Henry Timberlake was expecting there to be lots of beef about basically like his nephew being part of the pro-French side, but there was surprisingly no conflict between the 2 men over this because they prided themselves on keeping it professional. So it was just who Dragon Canoe wanted to associate himself with, and that was permitted. Yeah. I hope y'all get home safe and that you have a lovely day.